Hey friends, so I want to talk about the Psalms. We're in a series right now through the Psalms, well, at least some of them. But I thought it would be helpful for you to understand a little bit bigger basis on why we read the Psalms, what the Psalms are there to help us with, and what the Psalms are made of. There's so many of them. There's 150. If you were to open up the Bible about in half, you know where you would end? In the Psalms. 150 of these songs, poems, prayers. And let's talk about them a little bit. What are the Psalms? So the Psalms were written by several different people: David, Solomon, Moses, and these characters who we don't even really know, called the sons of Asaph, the sons of Korah, Asaph, Korah himself, I believe. All these different people over, honestly, thousands of years wrote these. And they're compiled all together later on in the history of Israel. Closer to the time of Jesus is when they were compiled, although they were written and sung throughout history. But the Psalms are musical poems. It would be a good category for them, which means they're intended to appeal to your emotion, which means that they are emotive and emotional. They're metaphorical, which implies that you shouldn't take everything in them as 100% historical fact. I mean, they have some Psalms where they talk about things like what sounds like the Loch Ness Monster or the great dragons from the deep. And you're like, what are they talking about? And it's metaphorical, it's imagery, it's building up to something to make you feel something. So let it be poetry, not historical. That's all I'm saying right there. So some of the Psalms were individual, some were written as communal, not as a personal song or a poem, but for the whole entire people group of Israel. But the fact that they were written together shows that they are written for communal usage. They are packaged together as one entity so that the people of Israel and now the church can use them as a guide for what? A guide for how to worship. That's what they're intended to be. And Psalm 1 is the intro into this whole book. And it's not just the first psalm, but it's actually the theological guideline for the Psalms. So when you read the Psalms, what should you expect? Well, Psalm 1 tells you that God blesses those who delight in the law of God and they commit themselves to living in covenant with God. And if you don't do those things, you should expect another set of realities. And the Psalm as a book teaches us what it looks like to live in obedience to God, in covenant with God. There are all different types of Psalms. So lament is the biggest category of Psalms. There are 60 laments in the book of Psalms, and laments are written in, there are these deep, emotive Psalms that talk about the pain and the suffering. They're written in times of struggle and of pain and of grief, and they're always asking God to move with trust that God will move, because they're written by people who delight in the law of God and have committed themselves to covenant with God, yet are honest about what's going on inside. That's the lament. The largest grouping, almost half of the Psalms are laments. Thanksgiving is the next biggest group, and these Psalms are praising God for who God is and for God's greatness towards the people of Israel, and within that, towards all of humanity. There's about 15 of those. There's Psalms that are the history of salvation, a review of God's history of moving and saving the Israelites from times where they needed deliverance, where they were enslaved, where they were in bondage. There's celebration psalms, which are communal. They're very Israel-specific psalms, and they're often king-specific, which means that they're written about ceremonies that were happening with David or Solomon or other kings. They're written for those times of ceremony. There's wisdom psalms, which sound a lot like the book of Proverbs. And lastly, there's songs of trust, which are just echoing that God can be trusted at all times, even in times of pain and despair. So friends, why do we read the Psalms? Why do we care about the Psalms? Here, let me give you 3 quick reasons why. They help us learn how to worship. What words can we use when we worship? What does it look like to worship God? How do we do this well? The Psalms help us with that. 2, they help us to learn how to talk honestly to God. What words can I use in my interactions, in my prayer time with Jesus, and still be respectful and honoring towards Him? 3, they show us how important it is to meditate on what God has done for us. God is good, and He's moved through history, and He's still moving, and He's there with us in the realities of what it is that we're going through right here, right now, and He's worthy to be worshiped and praised. That is what the Psalms teach us.